right? What if you bring a bunch of people together that has like a shared ethos through something we all understand, which is like radio, right? With shared interest of music and love of music. And in, like the most interesting things that have happened in the last, 5 to 10 years are like NTS. Like NTS Radio is probably the most interesting thing that happened in the last 10 years because of what they've built, where it came from and what it became. And it became that thing, despite the problems with the internet. In fact, it became those things because of the internet. It could become that. So there is still like amazing stories. Like No Signal is another thing that I love, which is like a UK radio station. Well, platform movement, whatever they've become. And I'm seeing that in fashion quite a lot. Some of the stuff that I got really obsessed with on TikTok at the moment is a lot of the fashion brands that are popping up, where people are like, young designers are really sharing their process day by day and building these like really like fanatical followings that are part of the journey of the creation. And that's something that's I think is like an exciting niche in that TikTok world that maybe a lot of like older generations are not seeing is this like honesty of brand building. I think that's something that crypto could learn a hell of a lot from, right? Like this kind of like distant founder, invisible founder, thing, which gets a bit God complexy at times. The real cool shit that's happening in the world right now is happening like one to one on TikTok, right? Some of the worst stuff is happening, but I think there's stuff happening in there that's really fucking cool that a lot of people are not seeing, right? There's kids that are making incredibly engaging, cool content that's not trashy at all. It's like how I build this thing. What are we doing day to day? Like they're filming what they're shipping, but what they're shipping is making a new GARM. Like going to the factory to try and get it sorted out, working on InDesign to fix problems, and sharing all of that. So when that thing drops, people want to buy it. Just making 100 of them, selling them out in 2 seconds. Like and then going again. And that's one of my tips of something that's really caught my attention at the moment.
Welcome to UFO, a podcast where artists, musicians, and tech creators talk about the future, a place for revolutionary ideas. I'm your host, Nick Hollands, and on today's show, Sound of Fractures, aka Jamie. He's an electronic music producer from London who released his debut album recently, which is called Scenes. The style incorporating elements of garage, breaks, and electronica, and as he says, shaped by hip-hop, UK dance music, and soul. In his music, he leans into telling stories from his life and experience, with textures and samples captured from his phone, for example. A track on the record, Willow's Heartbeat, features the sound of his daughter's heartbeat. The record was released as an experiment in co-creation, where collectors and engaged community participated. Over 350 memories were submitted and turned into visual scenes, capturing a moment in time. People stopped and took time out of their lives and engaged in this creative process that connected music and emotions. Scenes is a great example of being creative and trying new things, to take things beyond the day-to-day of posting yet another track into the void, into Spotify streaming algorithms, and sitting on autopilot. As you'll hear in this episode, Jamie is also a record collector, an educator and academic. We met each other during ETH Berlin back in May this year, or June, and had the chance to hang out and talk a lot about music at an event that was put on by Refraction. And Jamie was also DJing the day before at the AFK event put on by Lens. It seems we're roughly in the same kind of age and therefore share a lot of musical references, artists and records that we've been into over the years, and some of those formative experiences back in the earlier 2000s when the world of music was a very different place. Seemingly something of a golden age now in our minds. We've seen the internet change in so many ways, and for the music industry and for how artists are supposed to, let's say, sell their work and manage to make some amount of money. SoundCloud and Bandcamp was the thing, and then streaming happens. And in this podcast, Jamie and I get into some lore about those music origins, listening to records from artists like Radiohead, Burial, and earlier 2000s US hip-hop, the impact of Dizzy Rascal in breaking UK rap music around the world, Jamie's experiences of buying stacks of records and going back to the house with friends to sit and find samples for days on end, That process of finding stuff that is totally novel and unexpected. You're hearing it only because, you found a physical record and captured a moment. It's worth wondering if this is as much of a thing these days, as artists can do a lot from the laptop and digital only. If that's the case, how does this change the music that's being created? How do scenes form and sustain themselves? We talk about areas of interest for music on the internet, what's happening in the on-chain scene, with platforms continually changing the rules of the game. Artists are responding to rapid change in a continually shifting landscape. So how best to build a home for yourself on the internet as an artist? And what of the future of music? This is UFO 65. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors helping to put UFO on the air. Hire is a lifestyle. Hire is an on-chain network of optimists, creatives, and builders born on Base and Farcaster. The Hire token is a community token on Base used for funding ideas and initiatives aligned with Hire's core ethos of agency and optimism in all their endeavors, both individually and together. It's an experiment in discovering a brand. It's yours, everyone's, and no one's. You can add to it, remix, destroy and rebuild. An open canvas for creativity with few boundaries. Hire is looking for high agency crypto natives. Join the channel on Farcaster and go to the website at aimhire.net. International Meme Fund, IMF, is a DeFi protocol for borrowing money against your meme coins, with IMF serving as the protocol utility and revenue token. It began as a humorous idea among friends at the ETH Global Sydney Hackathon. Memes have achieved escape velocity in the crypto industry, forming their own market with dedicated participants. Some memes have grown into multi-billion-dollar valuations and ecosystems. The team at IMF believes it's now crucial to have native liquidity and financial infrastructure for the meme sector. To learn more about this newly emerging project, head to internationalmeme.fund. Let's join in conversation where I've asked Jamie to kick things off by dialing the time machine back to his origins in the UK music scene.
Like when you say like where did it start in terms of a scene, I think for me the first time I really felt part of something was my friends run a UK hip hop night called Kung Fu. And if you were like of a certain age and a certain demographic and lived in London, that's where you went. It was like the only place that we knew of. I mean, it was quite like backpackery hip hop, I guess. There was like a different culture happening at the same time in London. But that's kind of with the first time I was like hanging out, meeting rappers, meeting producers, listening to records, in my late teens, like early 20s. I'm making music where it was like I felt inside a thing and part of a movement. Like we were making records and the DJs were playing the records and we were like going to the night. I was handing out beat CDs. I was doing that kind of like early part of my like production career where looking back it was really exciting because I was making beats that week, taking them to the clubs, meeting rappers, making records of the week the day after, and playing them a week, like a couple of weeks later, like making dub plates, cutting records, going round to shops and selling them hand to hand, which felt like old fashioned 5 years later, but looking back now is so relevant to where we're at, right? Like we're selling music hand to hand, like person to person again. So yeah, that's kind of like the first time I felt part of a scene.
Where is this at on the timeline, and what kind of moment was UK music up to in terms of like genres, records, and in the movement? Like what was in the zeitgeist, would you say, as people are passing around like, beats and tapes and what have you?
We were listening to American hip hop mainly, like the dregs of kind of like the end of the Dilla DJ Premier era, but more kind of the beginning of um I don't know, I guess like really I'm trying to think back, but like we were like Dipset. And like that kind of like weird gap that was kind of like early Jay-Z, New York, maybe like high tech, DJ high tech, Quali, Common, like that kind of like sample based movement. That was what I was really into. But at the time there was no black music industry in the UK, right? Like we didn't have like one extra. There was nothing played on radio. I mean, like making those records at that time got me my first cuts on a major label, but the only person I could work with was like pop R&B. There was no like rappers signed to major labels in the UK. It's just like we've come so far since then. There was a few acts that were doing cool things that were kind of had like a lot of buzz. But it was also like a little bit before grime, like grime was just kind of kicking off. It was like we were coming out of garage and into grime, but it was just that was its own subculture. And I was kind of more at that time into like sample-based hip hop. It was probably like a bit before, but I guess it kind of like rolled into like early Kanye West, like sample-based hip hop. Yeah. And the UK just didn't have anything. I think that I'm trying to think. You won't know any of the names, right? But there was like a rapper called Tinchy Strider who kind of like came through like an underground scene but blew up doing like rapping on dance records, almost like Flow Rider, like Euro house style tracks with rapping on. And that's the first person I can think of getting a deal. So yeah, there was nowhere for us to go, right? Like, and in a way that was cool because we had like our own world, which was selling records.
That's super interesting to hear of this kind of like that little time snapshot because it's almost surprising to hear for someone who I wasn't there in person that like UK music was having that phase. I can certainly say like globally and in my own life, like UK music is like a huge part of the spectrum of what I've always been into and everything, right? Like UK music is breathtakingly impactful and influential around the world and what have you. And everything that it's evolved into over the last decade and more, couple decades and all that coming out of, like rave culture and all that your sound system culture, all this stuff over the years. And really interesting to hear about this little pocket of time where it was all those sort of like US artists, sample based kind of, what am I thinking of? Like Stone's Throw kind of stuff and all that was like, because that was also very influential and happening in the scene in Australia, music scene in those days as well.
I'm probably like mixing up, like decades in a way,
Sure.
but in my mind, like when I look back, we had like Soul to Soul and like Sade and Seal and like there was stuff happening in like mainstream that was black music, but there wasn't really like rap or hip hop, like there was like some poppy crossover things. Um, I think that's why it felt underground and maybe like So Solid was like, another way that like rap was like crossing over and probably a little bit later than that, like early Dizzy, Dizzy Rascal and Boy Better Known things were kind of like starting to cross over, but there wasn't any, and maybe there still isn't any like hip hop. But I look now and at least see, you know, I don't know, like apart from the whole drill movement, there is, Stormzy and Wretch 32 and Little Sims, and there's way more happening, right? Like, there's way more happening now. And at that time, there was basically like Tim Westwood on Radio One, who would
Right,
just play
right.
like American hip hop, um, and there was late night shows. We were there to hear the newest American records as much as we were anything else.
Great point on why radio is the greatest thing. Very often, it's like, well, there was that, one or two, those radio hosts were always playing like the great records, like that always exists. You brought up like Dizzy Rascal as well. Be interested to ask from your perspective, like how much of a catalyst do you think, like Dizzy kind of breaking out with those first couple of records or whatever, like how much of a catalyst was that in how it's then evolved from the scene that you're describing into what we see now, where it feels like hip hop is, you know, a huge part of what's happening in the UK. It's taken over so much of the scene.
It's way more. I mean, in a way, it was way more ahead of its get than we even realized, right? Like, if you go back and listen to those records, they were a mix of like the kind of street stuff that he was doing, but also there's that side of it that like when I go back now and hear like Fix Up, Look Sharp and things, it almost reminds me of more like what Tyler's doing, right? Where it kind of like it sits in this kind of what we would call now like alternative space, right? Where it's like sampling different types of records and different genres, like rock music, but also like keeping its like essence. I mean, I always remember it because I remember going to LA for the first time for a writing trip, and like the only thing that people had heard of in terms of like black music in the UK was Dizzy. Like every, LA is very like what they call, like Anglophiles, right? They love like like British culture and British music. I do remember going to LA the first time, and it was actually the same time that like I think like the Blueprint had just come out. But like people were like, oh, when you said you were English in the industry, they were like, oh, I love Dizzy. Everyone's like, I love Dizzy. I was like, okay, at least like someone's getting somewhere.
Yeah.
Someone's reached the bubble.
I mean,
Uh,
everyone loved Dizzy. Now you've got me thinking about the production on those records as well. Like it was super cutting through, and MIA is also coming to mind for that like production on those records. And like you see, I think you can find YouTube clips of her like producing those records out of like a laptop speaker on like Fruity, well, not Fruity Loops, but something like that. But yeah, I remember in that time as well, something like MIA and those records. Like I have such rose tinted glasses for like the early 2000s and all the music that was coming out then. It was just like unreal.
it was an amazing time. I think like so much of that forged what I do now, right? Like because I see that as being like to me as like a young person who grew up playing in a rock band, but also ended up being a hip hop producer. That sat alongside like Tricky and like Portishead and the whole kind of like
Totally.
yeah, that whole the trip hop movement and Uncle, but also like drum and bass, like Ronnie Size and like the kind of the beginning of that move from like jungle to drum and bass. There was like so like LTJ Bukem and like Four Here. There was so much going on there that had like soul and samples and
Yeah.
like was pulling from like British dance music and American hip hop. I even remember like there was an artist called Mr. Hudson in the Library that was kind of like a very British like indie hip hop kind of thing where there was just these little like spikes of moments where I was, which felt like home, like felt like I was in someone recently about like when I felt a part of something in the UK for the first time. And it was at jungle raves and drum and bass raves, or, like in Bristol and Brighton and being like, this feels like ours. This feels like British, like it, I don't feel we're taking, it's remixing and taking things and that mix of like Jamaican culture that was coming over from Jamaica and from the people that live here and mixing all these things up that felt like I don't want to say the word proud because I'm not very good. I'm not one of those people, but definitely felt like okay, this is ours. And the same with grime music, even though that wasn't my world, like growing up, like it definitely like is a part of like our identity to have something that feels like ours in the UK, which was exciting.
Yeah, like from my experiences, like having opportunities to like experience music events and shows and the scene in the UK, and whatever, and just like UK culture generally. But there is this like, I don't know, what would I say, like this eternal undercurrent of the kind of counterculture or punk or just this sort of sensibility and vibe and energy or spirit about it. It's almost like some eternal font of great music, apparently, like just continually turning over, which is super interesting to experience.
There's a really, really brilliant book that came out this year called Party Lines by Ed Gillett, which is like the history of British dance music, but it's kind of the history of contemporary dance music in a way. But really brilliant book. Like it starts off with like the emergence of like Jamaican sound systems and the kind of like to traveler movement in the UK, which was, like they were both very UK things in a way, because of the pressures of policing, because of the pressures of laws, because of like the conservative government in the 80s. Really great book. I love that stuff because, I'm really like when you look back at the formation of scenes and how the pressure cooker of the world that's happening in real life creates these things, like there's like a strong tie between the birth of grime and like youth clubs in the UK that were eventually shut down. But also, why grime didn't blow up earlier, right? Like why garage and grime got shut down by the government and gun laws are basically systematic racism. But how all these things fit together is great. But if you're interested in that stuff, definitely, yeah, check out Party Lines. Really cool book.
That's a good tip. I'm reading a couple books at the moment focusing on UK music as well. I'm just completely spacing on their names.
Yeah, I mean, it's really because there's some like really unique things that happen. Like dance music is like the way it emerged in the UK is very different to how it emerged in America, for example. Like and a lot of those traveling sound systems and stuff became like the festivals that we know today, but also like birthed Ibiza and that kind of the Ibiza movement. How those things interconnect are really interesting to me.
So it'd be cool to jump across and sort of turn on to talking about like your own music journey, production, and like I guess your discography and whatever. And I'm really interested to kind of do the tape notes kind of look at this. Like, how do you like to produce? What's your kind of writing flow like typically? Things like that. Like how do you start like workshopping ideas and or I guess how has your production or writing style or even your sound kind of evolved over time?
Looking back, I can kind of see now how everything fits together. It's funny. I mean, I started out making music on an MPC and a sampler, right? So I had this like really early introduction of, that's what the people I love use. I'm going to go and buy one, get a job, save up for 3 months, 4 months, buy this thing and bring it home and just all you've got is a manual and your ears, right? There's no YouTube tutorials. You don't know anyone else that makes music. Um, and I remember like at first being like, oh, you kids are so lucky with YouTube and things. But now I'm like, I'm so lucky that I learned that way because learning anything is just like doesn't bother me. Like I've used Logic, I've used Cubase, I've used Reason, I use Pro Tools for long periods, I've used MPCs. I feel like I can pick up anything and make things. But looking back, the through line is sampling for me. Like sampling's always been the through line for me. It's how I discovered soul music. It's how I discovered funk and disco and like rare groove and like all this kind of stuff was discovered through sitting with boxes of records and listening for samples. And I still approach making music that way. I very I'm not very good at starting with I'm not very good at starting with a blank page in the sense that like I like to find things and piece them together. That's my way of like starting music every day. And when you start out in the kind of pop music industry or beat making industry, you have to just make music all the time, right? That's not a new thing. The new thing is releasing music all the time, but you still had to have new music to play people every day in a session, right? Like new music, like if you're working with the same rapper and they're coming every week, they're blasting through like 20 beat ideas to find the one they want at least, like every time you hang out with them. So you're just always making music and sampling really allows you to, like find a vibe, find a sound, find like an emotion and build on that, and like it takes you to a place. It's almost like you don't have to rely completely on your brain. And that's something in the music, all the music I love, like whether that's like Frank Ocean, Jay Dilla, or even like, James Blake or Radiohead, or, like to me, those things have like this kind of thing in common, which is like analog, electronic, emotion, and like, a bit of rawness and a bit of wonkiness, which is kind of I've now learned is like what I do with my music, I kind of think everything I make has to have those elements in. Um, so that's how I see it. Yeah, I start with the sound. These days I start with a lot from my phone because clearing samples got so messy, but also then like using splice and things like that felt a bit contrived after a while, even though like I do use those platforms, you know, and we've all seen those YouTube videos and TikToks where so and so made a great record with this sample. Um, but for me personally, like I'm putting my personal life into my music a lot these days. I flick through and just look for phone videos, background noise, talking, anything, just to get me like get an atmosphere, and that's where I start.
I think that's really cool. I dig that approach. You hear of a lot of artists kind of utilizing the voice memo function on their phone to capture stuff and put that into records and so on. I really also I like the kind of the cap like creating a vibe, creating a sort of oral environment makes me think of records like Burial and that just really kind of transports you and it becomes this like hallucination kind of experience of this world and whatever in these textures. And I think I've noticed that in your work as well. I think it's cool.
I love Burial, got like a massive influence on me. I think I see a lot of people doing it because young producers now aren't using samples. Like we all just grew up using samples. Like those Burial records are all just like records, right? And maybe there was like an arrogance or a confidence or just like a lack of respect for for the legal system, where I have records out there with loads of uncleared samples in, that are not audibly recognizable as a famous sample, right? Like you chopping things up, you're reversing them, you're time stretching them, they become something else. They become a collage. But embedded in that is all like the physical life of a record, right? Like the wear and tear, the sound, the difference between every vinyl and every player. And people just don't have those setups anymore, right? Like even like at times I was using like SoulSeek or LimeWire and just, you could find someone's collection and they would be recording 7 inches because they were like cataloging their record collection, right? Or just go and buy a box, like 10, we just go and buy like 5 boxes of records from like a secondhand shop or from like a car boot sale and just spend Saturday smoking weed, football on silent in the background, and going through loads and loads and loads of records and just like all these different sounds. And I think that that's really interesting looking back because now like people have so much music at their disposal, but like no, I don't know, like no way. It's like overwhelming. Like where do you start? I do know some great sample diggers, but I think there was something, just as I'm saying it, there was something different about that physical experience of a box of unknown things and like the process of picking them up and taking them out and just not knowing what you're going to hear. Quite different to going to YouTube or going to Spotify and typing in Rare Soul and and going through a Rare Soul playlist.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more strongly. That's I don't know. I hadn't really been thinking of that recently. Like I do think about kind of the social algorithms or internet algorithms and the little sort of pocket realities that people are kind of being like sheltered into. It's like YouTube has 200 recommendations a day and maybe you're into weird old soul so it'll like serve that up to you or whatever. But yeah, like going out into the real physical world, kind of like going into a secondhand bookshop and you don't know what you're going to find. It's that kind of the magic of things and how much of that is lacking on the internet these days, and like how is that also influencing or changing like the sound and production of music these days? Because like surely there's still people, plenty of people out there like digging for records and still doing it in that old way, or from your to your knowledge, is it more likely young producers are just laptop only and whatever and ripping things and stuff?
Yeah, there's always exceptions, right? And it seems like the kind of time where I would expect to be hearing that kind of thing coming back in a major way, right? Like almost like when you were saying that, I was thinking there's just like a different well-being and mental side to it that we didn't appreciate at the time. Like me and my mate, who are a production team, sitting in a room together, doing a thing together that wasn't like we just need to make a beat, right? It was like we were almost like exploring like the history of music in this kind of environment that didn't we didn't have a phone in the same way, right? Like
Yeah.
if we were doing that now, we'd probably be filming it and chopping it up into content and being like, today I bought a box of records and we chopped up 10 things and it'd probably be good content. But again, it's like we were really connected in that moment, like and in like a bubble that I'm so grateful that I got to live in a time where we got to be like that, right? We just got to be, and now we have to like create it and push ourselves to do it. And hopefully more and more people are doing that. But maybe that's something that we as producers, don't get that people who play in bands do, right? Like if you're in a band, you're still going to a rehearsal room, you're closing the door and you're getting lost. And I guess as a producer, you're doing that in your headphones. But I think it's a very contained process a lot of the time, right? Like you're on a computer, you're sampling from your computer, you're finishing it in your computer, you're staying within like certain software. And yeah, I would never say that one thing's more or less creative, but I do think there was definitely like some, I don't know, social benefits to like making stuff outside of the box. And I do know lots of people are doing that intentionally now, like, like turning off their screen and like jamming in their room or, like in chopping those things up. So there's lots of different versions of that, but I'm still, yeah, like I said, I'm glad that I went through that process and I miss it, right? Like I miss that. It's why people are buying vinyl, no doubt, because that is coming back.
I guess that's one of those, like, they call it the 10,000 hours kind of story of kind of just doing the thing so much and over, and then you can look back now at a different stage of life, just kind of like, man, like that was always the best times. For some reason, like yesterday, I think randomly, like Amnesiac came in on my headphones. I'm forgetting which track. Oh, You and Whose Army, which then goes into I'm forgetting, it gets to Knives Out or something like that. But I just listened to those three tracks, and it reminded me of this podcast I listened to a year or so ago called "Is It Rad in Your Head?" or something, a Radiohead thing. It's by these three guys from the UK. They go super deep. It's one of the nerdiest podcasts I've ever seen, but incredible. And it's like they do, I don't know, 30 hours just going through all the Radiohead records, how they were made, the context of it. Just like, it's like they found every piece of information and media ever about Radiohead and they kind of put it all into a story or whatever. But when they talk about going from the Bends and OK Computer and becoming like the biggest guitar band in the world, there's that interesting story about, is it I'm sorry, what's the track name? Like, I'm not here, this isn't happening.
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, that transition you just mentioned was like that was like a life-changing moment for me.
Right?
Like going from the Bends, which I loved the Bends, right? Like that was a big record for me. Um, but that was what was exciting about music, right? Is how a band just didn't stay still, right? How like the difference between those two records sonically was like mad, right?
Yeah.
Like it was just like, and they always try and do that, but it's never been more like apparent than the difference between those albums. It was like I guess in a way like I compare it sometimes in my head to like College Dropout and the Kanye West record Heart.
Yeah,
Oh
Heartbeats and 808s or something.
yeah, but that is what being an artist should be to me. Like that was such an exciting time to get that new Radiohead album and just be like, you couldn't have predicted it, right? Like it was just like so different and production and songwriting and like sonically, they just kept it was still them, but they just kept pushing it and taking it somewhere else. And that was such a cool moment. That was very like of the time, like that sudden move to like synths and analog and like the weaving of like that stuff together with India. I played in a band for years, so I was, that was super inspiring to me to hear like that clashing together of the same way that like Beck was, like at that time,
Yeah.
which starting to use samples and like you said, MIA and there was like trip hop was happening. There was just this really cool moment where like soul music and indie music and drum and bass and dance music and samplers were just being like it was like a new world. Like having a sampler was just samplers just changed everything. All of a sudden, in your house, you could do all these things that you could never do before. And yeah, I guess like technology is continuing to do that. I don't know what technology will do next, but that was such a cool moment.
Yeah, I have this sort of like, yeah, I mean, I was experiencing all of that. Uh, that was when I was in high school. So, OK Computer or whatever. And then, Kid A is still one of my favorite records ever and was like always one of my favorites back in that time. But from listening to that podcast recently, or a year ago, apparently, when they go into like the creation of Kid A. And so, yeah, there was this story about, oh shoot, have I lost it again? Oh yeah. there's this story about how to disappear completely. And I don't know if you've heard this one, but it's like Tom York, uh, OK Computer happens. They become the biggest band in the world, headlining festivals. They had like a show that didn't go great at Glastonbury, like a headline set because all the sound went wrong. They couldn't hear themselves. So it was like a nightmare experience. And then they slingshot off on like a global tour, and along the way, like the wheels are kind of coming off at least. Certainly for Tom York, who's just like, this is not, it was not an ideal experience. And apparently he had a phone conversation with Michael Stipe, who they've always been tight with, in which Michael tells him like this mantra of like, I'm not here, this isn't happening. Like, this is going to be very helpful for you. Like, as you go through this, you're flashing around the world, interviews, all this bullshit, and whatever. And so, how to disappear completely. At some point, someone had asked Tom about like, what's your best song or favorite song, and he chose that one or whatever. But it's really interesting hearing the story of like the band gets back in the studio, and it's kind of like, right, no guitars, none of that. We're just going to figure out how to use drum machines and synths and all this stuff. And of course, Johnny Greenwood just like blasts off into the universe, bringing back all these crazy Kid A sounds and whatever. But yeah, I really got hooked back on a lot of Radiohead stuff like a year ago and whatnot after like really kind of delving into like the production of all that. And then there was that Kid A re-release, Kid Amnesiac kind of. There was like a book and like a reissue of the record with all these kind of studio offcuts and stuff like that.
God, I missed that. Yeah, I think the, bands like that sometimes things become so big that you kind of lose the connection with them. And it's like you have to give it time. I need time sometimes. I'm just like, I can't hear another person tell me that Radiohead's the best band in the world. It almost becomes like contrived. And I kind of need to wait till the right time to rediscover it. I'm like that with when new albums come out sometimes. Like if there's an artist that I really love and their album comes out, I do this thing that really irritates all my music friends, where sometimes I just won't listen to it for 3 weeks. I need to listen to it in my own space without all this noise and just like listen to it on my own terms without like all these other opinions in my head. And sometimes it's like I have to just like park a record until the hype's died down. And then I love listening to things for the first time. And it's like, yeah, I guess like the ritual of, I mean, I love albums as well, old school, apparently, in that way. Um, I just like listening to like moments in time in people's lives. Like, I love that. It's a shame that we're losing that. And really, the argument, of course, against it is that albums only exist because labels decided they wanted to sell things for more money. So we want 9 songs instead of, but in that, artist owned it, right? And they became this like world building capturing of like a year of a life, right? Like, um, which I think became special, and I still think is special. But you just only if you're a big artist, you really get to do that. Um, but yeah, that's something that I hope we don't lose. I hope artists stick with it. Artists do not want to give up on albums. Like loads of people keep putting out albums, and it's like labels and like the industry are like, we don't need albums. Like teenagers are like, what's an album? But like as artists, I'm glad that people are still sticking with it because when it's special, it's really special.
Yeah, because your album is like it's like a film or a book or a painting or perhaps a collection of works or something something like that. This is why like Song Exploder is another of my favorite, or might be my favorite podcast in general. But like hearing the story of how it was made and what inspired it and all that, and it kind of becomes this expression. Like I totally, it's not a controversial opinion to say that great albums are probably my favorite thing that exists, in general.
I mean, context matters, man. Like I love the Dissect podcast on they did the Frank Ocean stuff, and tape notes and those things as well because context is important. It's interesting, like it's in the same way that it's really interesting now, to go back and explore what was re-explore what was happening at that time in the world and how that was, like reflected in the music being made. Because people are like, oh, especially like when I meet some of my students, they're like, oh, yes, like I wish I grew up in that time, or like I wish I grew up in this time. Um, that is interesting when you look back and think about that, like how what's happening in I don't know, the zeitgeist is like reflected in the type of like art that comes out and technology. And I'm sure I don't know if we'll look back on this time. We'll see. It's so fragmented. There's always something special about every time. But it is interesting at the moment that it's interesting to me at the moment that whether we'll be able to find anything. Like someone said to me the other day that, all this special stuff is happening. It's just not crossing over. I think, a friend of mine, CXY, shared a tweet about it where someone was talking about there is great culture happening. It's just not crossing over. It's happening in these small pockets, right? It's like the kind of Yancey Strickler Dark Forest thing. It's like, so what's interesting about that is like what it's going to be like going back in time and trying to find it, especially if it's getting deleted off the internet, right? Like, what's that going to be like in 20 years' time? Well, we know that things will come out of this period that are really special, but it's going to be interesting to try and find it, especially because really, the things on the surface are all made by senior, you know, what would you call it? Like, like catalog artists, like we're still talking about Drake and Kendrick, right? Um, and I wouldn't say that there's like we're not talking about a new SZA, a new Beyonce, a new Drake, a new Kendrick, a new Taylor Swift, right? In the way that maybe we used to think there was always a next one coming. I know that everyone will have their opinion on who the next one is, but I do think like the fragmentation of the internet right now is particularly different to like other times in history when it comes to music and art.
It's super interesting because this taps into the kind of information universal space that we all kind of exist in now and in the past. It's like the influence of radio stations, music magazines, early internet, perhaps, and whatever. And like a fragmentation, but it also, like if we talk about like music as it started like exploding on like SoundCloud or all this type, like when it started kind of finding its feet on the internet a little bit, things there could be discovery, like something could just kind of hit and go off, and now maybe that stuff's happening on TikTok or whatever. I don't know, whatever. But I think the point you're making about like how are we going to find this stuff retroactively, and most or very very often we discover what was truly significant in the now and later retroactively. But this is kind of veering into the kind of the Web3 internet stuff that we're both interested in as well. When you talk about if something's going to be deleted off the internet at some point, and at a very basic level, some of these like open protocols for file storage and sharing and minting and all that, I feel like that's still the most crucial aspect of this all, maybe even the step before the financial side. It's just being able to release stuff that will stay released and doesn't disappear or go down because apparently what was this? It was like Paramount owns MTV now, and so they deleted all of the content from MTV News website last week or something, and
Yeah,
apparently we lost
see the
decades.
Yeah, I mean, it is important. It's a historical archive, right? Like going, what we thought was trash TV on MTV turned out to be like the first ever like hip hop TV show, right? Like the you know cultural snobs of the time would have turned their noses up at that. The first music videos that only existed because of MTV. Like that was the only real reason for anyone to have a music video was the existence of MTV. Are like incredible like cultural artifacts, like those combinations of like great directors and music and those coming, they are their art, right? If you look back at like Michelle Gondry videos with like Fatboy Slim and or like those that moment and those the time when videos were art, which we've lost because there's no financial reason for them to exist, but hopefully those will and are reframed as art. The problem again still is where they exist, right? Is they only exist on low quality re-uploads on YouTube. It's the financial incentives, and popular music has an issue, which is that it's still struggling to be considered art. Like all this money from governments goes to preserving opera and goes to preserving ballet and goes to preserving classical music, and I hope, I hope that in time, we will be able to go and see an exhibition at the Tate of the greatest music videos, like of a time period, um, and things like that. I don't know if we will, but I hope, in my mind, that's where they belong, right? But we'll see.
This is such a strong point, and I have friends in Australia, for one thing, who for what, a decade or more have been producing music videos, and that's kind of like what their agencies and studios are set up to do. But then they observe that time where it kind of like it's like you had to make the music video to drop it on YouTube, get 50,000 hits, whatever, you get booked at a music festival, like the wheels keep turning or whatever. But the kind of the financial side kind of started to drop out on that, and also observing that, and Latasha talks about this too, and it's a big part of like the work that she's doing is just like music videos matter. Actually, there's a big part of what it's about is making these videos and stuff. And we talk about an album as a piece of art. Often, if there's only one or two music videos made for a couple of the singles, but it kind of becomes part of the release and it's kind of tied together. So it's like another struggle when we talk about music, the internet, the financial side, and whatever, is like if we're losing the visual side or some of that storytelling side, like it's a shame.
I'm literally having conversations with the director I love about making a video together. And I just keep having to remind him there is just no financial reason for this to exist for me. And I'm obsessed with music videos, right? And we're both obsessed with the same kind of stuff. And we both want to do it. But I do keep having to drawing him back to like, as a musician right now, it doesn't matter how good this video is, there is a very small chance it will be so good that everybody shares it with each other, right? Because they're just sharing bite-sized content. It's not like that common anymore. The problem is with the art is like it still matters to us and it still matters, but will anyone see it, right? And I think that's again another reason why like I've become so interested in like that niche of what, like traditional digital artists found on the blockchain, right? Which was that it's a small niche, but it's a place that allows me to find people that value digital assets, right? And even that language is just like, it feels awful to say it because it's so awkward. But that's really what's happening, right? Is that, I can really like focus in on this niche of people that like value the feeling of ownership. And most people who use social media don't understand that language because it's hidden, right? Like they think they own everything on their Instagram, right? But I saw someone a few weeks ago who was like a classic drum and bass producer in the UK, hadn't used his Facebook for years, but had spent years building it, had thousands of followers, and it got deleted for like a an infringement. And he hadn't used it for 3 years, right? So he hadn't done, right? But something had happened with that account where it had been flagged, and it had been deleted, and like 3 weeks later, they're still trying to get any kind of response from like Meta as to why and how. And it was just one of those examples again where the blockchain doesn't solve that because there's not as many people who want to use it as Facebook. But what it does at least give you is like, yeah, just like, like a bedrock, like a foundation that at least feels like it's not all for, it could not all be for nothing, right? It will still exist somewhere. And the benefits have been that, you found this really engaged group of people who are looking for more. Like I've always said that about this movement was just that the best thing I can say always is that there is a bunch of people looking for more. And that has led them here because, there's not many places that you can disrupt and find different things. And yes, lots of people came for speculation, but there is also a lot of people that aren't there for speculation. They're just there because they're not getting enough from the other things, right? Like emotionally, I don't know, taste wise, whatever it might be. And that space has provided that for a lot of people. So it's been really exciting for me, a place where there's less rules.
Yeah, I think this Web3 and on-chain space as well, it's like the people are here also because they know about it. Like they're savvy enough. And once you're aware of it, you can't help but kind of like be involved in it. It's kind of like a scene that we've fallen into. Um, but also noticing that like many people in there are themselves artists, writers, musicians, like creative people of all different forms, and they might just be working in a DeFi company or whatever, but they're still into this kind of stuff. So it is this niche scene, but like I feel like if you're an artist or a musician, like that's also quite an interesting audience to kind of be engaged with, or kind of, and to whatever extent, it probably does still stand almost entirely separate to your kind of mainstream audience or whatever, like your regular audience on, say, Instagram or whatever. Like you're DJing at this club, and so like that's where you're kind of really connecting in the IRL. But to some extent, the kind of the on-chain crypto scene is more like it is a global distributed group of people who are just kind of extremely online, and they may be listening to your record and all that. But it's interesting how those worlds are still separate, and I imagine blending more over the next, say, 5 years.
They are very separate, and they speak very different languages, but at the same time, it's become, because I'm interested in like music research and things, because I've been doing the lecturing stuff. That's become this other part of my life. It's the most incredibly interesting place to hold like a debate, right, about money, creativity, technology, and how all these things, because it intersects all those things in some really ugly ways and some really beautiful ways, right? It all like clashes together in this place, and it is kind of clashing together in social media as well at the moment, especially as streaming's become, like a low revenue, just incredibly low revenue. um, the on-chain stuff, and like has become really interesting for me, and it's constantly in flux. Like you have these moments where you're like, this is beautiful, this is different. And then you have another wave where you're like, oh, it's not, it's exactly the same. Like there is this embedded financial underpinning, which is like you said, is the primary thing, right? Like when I'm speaking to other people about why I use the blockchain, the back end of like my scenes project, I would, the very simple thing is that I can create a financial ecosystem without any middle people, right? Like I don't have to ask anyone's permission. I don't have to pay any money. I don't have to like have a middle person that I have to like invoice to or check in with or like account to, or like, it's beautiful in that respect, right? Like you can't do that anywhere else. But we are also like trapped in the attention economy, even within the blockchain, right? Because fads and phases and like anywhere are really important. Like what people think is hot and cool is still like a primary driver of why they will financially support something, right? Where musicians are still really leaning on this idea of like ownership and patronage and care, there is this huge underpinning in both sides, which is like, how does it look for me to support this thing? Yeah, like, or how financially does it look for me to support this thing? Like, what does this bet say about me, and what does this bet bring to me? And I think the hard journey of like the blockchain culture was, of course, the rising of the crashing of the markets, right? Which is that you have these booms of interest, and then like they are sucked out because the reasons for being there are very different for person to person. I think what we're getting to is that we're starting to like find more of each other who are here for the right reasons. And I think that's like a really exciting ground to build off, right? There's more people like me and you who are like building relationships because we're connecting through that, right? And that the kind of like the smoke of the kind of, I don't know, it's easy to call it speculative, but the people that are dipping in and out, yeah, there's like connections, there's like a stronger web of connections being formed between all the people that are here for the right reasons. And I think that there's definitely like an important job to do between us to like, like build things or do things together that the other world, that the people from outside of this thing can see, like, and see the kind of ethos in. And it takes for us to find each other, like friends with benefits and things like that. They've all been through their ugly moments, but I feel like that it is a good time at the moment for a lot of people who are looking, for want of a better word, who are interested in culture, art, or, creativity, that recognize the issues with the main like current systems, and like maybe this is still a place to do something different. I hope, like that's the hope. And I think that as these things develop, more people will look for it because the internet's just going to get worse. Instagram's getting worse. TikTok's getting worse. Like everyone was like, it's fine. What you got to do is you got to go on Instagram and don't worry about streaming. You got to sell short courses and get brand endorsements. But now everybody's trying to sell short courses and get brand endorsements, right? So like it just constantly gets oversaturated and oversaturated and oversaturated and, develops, habits that are unhealthy in the audience and in the artists. So yeah, I'm hoping that, we're still doing things in an interesting place for the right reasons. And that's still exciting to me.
Yeah, I tend to agree on the take that to an extent the internet is just going to get worse. That's part of the deal. But as you say, like people like ourselves kind of finding each other, that scene is continually growing. Like the more time that passes, there's just more people here who are very solidly here and doing really interesting things. And people who are, I don't know, they build projects, create art releases, or they're producing music that they want to pair with video and release in an interesting way, like you did with scenes and that whole thing. It's just like, I want to bring an interesting project through and I'm doing this thing. Also why I'm super excited about like UFOs, a radio station, and things like this that kind of becomes a network of networks. It is all interconnected. It's a big part of the magic of this technology is that we can have stuff that's streaming in. Maybe you discover it on the UFO radio station, but then I can just port straight across into that project or show or that label, collective, scene, whatever it is. Things can stream together. And if aspects of the internet are going away, I'm more excited about what everyone here is going to build to replace those things and what's going to happen over the next decade. I have this like crazy streak of optimism about, like if we like to look back on the early 2000s as some kind of magic time, like I feel like we're headed in towards a very good direction. So right now we feel like we're in a mess. We're in the middle of the 24 US election. Like whatever, like the world is completely upside down. But yeah, I feel like great things are coming out of this sort of on-chain scene, even over like the coming months and whatever. Also, something that you were saying was reminding me of the day-to-day of sort of being in the crypto on-chain scene a couple years ago. And it was like, it felt like there were multiple releases every day that you were just kind of minting because it was a friend of yours or someone who were kind of in the scene. And so it was like mints that were dropping on Mirror as a post or a crowdfund on Mirror, for example, or drops on Zora or all that kind of stuff was like super happening, or projects launching with an ERC20 through Seed Club, stuff like there was so much of that stuff happening. I look back on that period like in a really positive way, but now I'm realizing that we aren't quite in that moment now. It's a little different now. And say what's evolving with say Zora with their mobile app and shifting more into they're saying like it's an on-chain social app. It's more that kind of vibe. Foundation with Rodeo and all this other stuff that's going on. So like I think like the evolution and shift of Zora over the last couple of months as well is kind of like pretty significant like change in the landscape.
Huge, huge. I think like because it represented something, like, and I think, and it still does, but like, what creators are not familiar with is like VC capital, right? And startups, and it's been a huge learning curve because Zora represented something and that shifted. And it shifted because technology shifts, and it shifts because they have to survive, and it shifts because they've got bills to pay, and it shifts because maybe it's a good idea to shift. But the thing I think that what often is missed is that people need a reason to be here, right? And a lot of creators were here for a reason that they had created in their mind, right? Or maybe, that had been encouraged by platforms that were, positing a reason to come, which is that, permanence and value and culture. And really, in a time where there is less people here to collect those things, the shift has moved towards like meme culture and instant and, you know, the idea of, low cost and high volume. And it's a really big risk. It's a huge risk. It's a massive gamble, right? Like it could pay off, but they're taking this huge gamble that people are going to prefer Zora to Instagram, right? Or like a niche of people are going to move to this thing because it offers some kind of different ethos, and I really hope they do, right? But in the background is a bunch of people who's like, oh, I thought we were doing this thing together, and now we're not doing this thing together. And things are still permanent. I think we're still very platform focused, right? There's some people that are more experienced than me that are, always say to me, we're so early. We don't have Google search for the blockchain, right? Like it's not indexed in that way. So us as artists, we're kind of like preening and cultivating this garden. But what that garden often is our profile page. You know, we want this thing to like represent something, to be arranged in a certain way and be beautiful. When that profile page ceases to exist in the way that we imagine it to, we feel like that work's gone because we're still not, like we're not in that headspace of like it's permanent on the blockchain. Because really for us, we're like, well, it doesn't matter if it's permanent if no one can find it, right? Like, but we're moving to this place where some people like Sweetman and Yuri, who's doing in public, and they're, like we're moving into space of like, okay, what's my platform look like? Right. And now we're moving to space of like, okay, well, Zora is composable, right? It has an API. What happens if I build my platform and my world? And we're not quite there yet, but maybe with like Cursor AI and some of these tools, people, like artists will be able to start curating their own places and their own worlds. And I think that will alleviate some of what feels like what has felt like like a very quick shift. And it's not just Zora, it's the whole movement towards, crypto is crypto and it needs a reason for things to exist because all the companies are startups, right? They need numbers. They need to continually get funding. And I found that a very interesting thing to learn about, right? Because it's very like in that is another thing that's very interesting to me, right? Is how we create, how we produce art, how we distribute our work is really intrinsically linked to this ecosystem, the startup ecosystem that has a very specific way of working where like pivoting is bold and audacious and it's great entrepreneurship and it's being a great leader and it's being an intelligent founder, like pivoting at the right time. But when you're dealing with art, like you're pivoting away from a bunch of people that have bought into an ethos, you know and like what happens to that art that got left in that pivot, right? That's really interesting to me. What happens to those things, like in a land where we're talking about, we're going to do better than these places where your work can disappear. Well, what happened? This is the phase we're into. So now what happens when Showtime pivots to Dracula, right? Or Zora pivots to an app, or we don't know what's going to happen to sound next. But even, like a pivot from like high value, low additions to like extreme low cost opened up that system to a new type of a model, right? Which is not wrong or right. It's just a different model, right? Using boosts, using different ways to get in the charts, just normal music business. I've been in the music business for years. It doesn't faze me at all, but it is interesting, like what happens to the work. I think that's like, I think we're having that conversation openly a bit more, which I think is healthy because, like if we're trying to bring people in based on trust, I think, like we have to have that open conversation. Art hasn't had to have that conversation yet, right? Like foundation is still foundation, right? And yes, they've found a different way of pivoting, a different way of bringing in rodeo. Yeah, I love all this stuff. I think it's really interesting, but I also very much value like creator economy, creators, and art. And that dynamic might be something we look back on as a really interesting time, right? We have like founders of singular people, a lot of the time, small teams that builds a lot of trust based on like we're not Elon, right? We're not Mark Zuckerberg, right? In that world where they take 100% profit, we're rebuilding a new world, right? And it hasn't ended up being that different, right? In terms of like the wealth consolidation, it's definitely different. And in terms of like, yeah, what comes next? Who knows, right? There is a future where, Zora has ads on it, right? Like who knows? Who knows? We're on a crazy ride at the moment. And I mean, I guess the most important thing is these places survive still. The fact that Zora is still Zora, it still has like an ethos, it still has like an identity, and that the people that have built this thing still have a place in the world is important. And I'm exploring it and experimenting with it. But I do, yeah. There's probably like going to be a lot to unpack about this year when we look back. I think anyway.
I totally agree. All of that stuff is like really interesting to kind of watch it happening and evolving in real time. You make an interesting point about artists cultivating their little garden and their world and whatnot, their MySpace profile, and then it can go away or it changes quite a lot. And now it just looks differently. So it feels differently. But yeah, I mean, the shift with Zora, I feel like as you say, the model that was there before, or the way that people were using it and got used to it and things, was very like simple, straight out the box. We kind of
Right.
forget now. It's like now it's changing after what it had been about a year of Zora Protocol rewards and stuff, and that was a big shift in Zora Network that launched in what June 23, and all that stuff. And at the time, that was new, and then people got really sort of used to that, and the economics was set such. I think it was about you $2 a mint or this type of thing, and whatever. And now this is just like another shift of that. But
Right, because they've only just their first experience playing with algorithms, right? Like, what do you see? What do these new people see when they go on their app? Like, there's so much happening that they're at the beginning of this really like early journey of like, let's do this thing. Oh, now we've got this next thing to deal with, which is like, there's so much on here. Who sees what, right?
right,
And it's like it's going to be interesting to see like what decisions are made from like what is it's not a blank slate because that's wrong because people are coming to the app with expectations of what an app is, right? Especially when we're saying a like is the same as a spark or whatever it is, right? We're making these constant analogies visually and conceptually between like a system that exists. So it's going to be really interesting, like, is it going to be like Bandcamp, where, it's the place that people go that care about art, right? Like, or music or film. Is it, but, or is it, or is the output that we're going to replace Instagram? Like, we don't know where it's going. I think, like, the startup culture will challenge that because there's always an expectation of growth, right? And whether or not you can be a Bandcamp ever again, we don't know, right? Because a business that is self-contained, no, that's not self-contained anymore. But that yeah, that's going to be really interesting to see. I think we're in the midst of it as creators, playing with all these tools, and um, you know, sometimes it's like being caught in a whirlwind. Like we're kind of doing that, and we're doing the other stuff, right? And that, in a way, that's why I really, again, a unicorn case, but it's why I love someone like what Jack Butcher does, right? Which is that, it's an ecosystem. And if you have like the finances and the connections to build an ecosystem, that is an amazing thing. I experimented with that with scenes, but what I really learned is just like the dev costs and the time it takes to like really build out a world that is like off platform is astonishing, right? Like it's incredibly hard. So when I see projects like that, I'm like, this is an incredible thing, right? Like, when you go to, the Up Open End site and you log in and you see all the things you hold in your profile and you vote within the platform and you can communicate with each other within the, like that is quite an astonishing feat what they've created there. Is in terms of like an ecosystem around like an arts project. It's definitely one of the ones that really like stands out to me when I look at what's happening on chain. It's weathered the storm in a way that other things can't because the people taking part feel they are part of the ecosystem. Um, I don't know where it goes from here, but that is definitely something I keep going back to because it keeps going, right? Like it's like a co-creation ecosystem, which is very interesting to me.
yeah, I think these are the some of the most compelling things to be building. And you mentioned Sweetman and Yuri as well within public and these sorts of projects where all the conversation we're just having about Zora and whatnot, and like people got used to using it in a certain way or having their profile or whatever, and now that's changed, but there's still Zora protocol. You can build on top, and that's what I think people from Zora will also say of like, yeah, you can still like go. You can build you can build what you like, but you're also noting that for many artists, like it's quite a steep curve to go and build out your own thing. So maybe like building out new collective spaces, another plug for UFO radio there. Just
Yeah, UFO is doing like really interesting stuff. There's like with fam is doing some interesting stuff. There's some really like there's so much potential, right? And I think like what's interesting about UFO is like what happens if you build like a an ident you what happens if you build an identity first, right? And the identity is like the playground that you start like playing with what that can mean, right? What if you bring a bunch of people together that has like a shared ethos through something we all understand, which is like radio, right? With shared interest of music and love of music. And in, like the most interesting things that have happened in the last, 5 to 10 years are like NTS. Like NTS Radio is probably the most
100%.
interesting happened in the last 10 years because of what they built, where it came from and what it became. And it became that thing, despite the problems with the internet. In fact, it became those things because of the internet. It could become that. So there is still like amazing stories. Like No Signal is another thing that I love, which is like a UK radio station. Um, well, platform movement, whatever they've become. And I'm seeing that in fashion quite a lot. Some of the stuff that I got really obsessed with on TikTok at the moment is a lot of the fashion brands that are popping up, where people are like, young designers are really sharing their process day by day and building these like really like fanatical followings that are part of the journey of the creation. And that's something that's I think is like an exciting niche in that TikTok world that maybe a lot of like older generations are not seeing is this like honesty of brand building. I think that's something that crypto could learn a hell of a lot from, right? Like this kind of like distant founder, invisible founder, thing, which gets a bit God complexy at times. The real cool shit that's happening in the world right now is happening like one to one on TikTok, right? Some of the worst stuff is happening, but I think there's stuff happening in there that's really fucking cool that a lot of people are not seeing, right? There's kids that are making incredibly engaging, cool content that's not trashy at all. It's like how I build this thing. What are we doing day to day? Like they're filming what they're shipping, but what they're shipping is making a new GOM. Like going to the factory to try and get it sorted out, working on InDesign to fix problems, and sharing all of that. So when that thing drops, people want to buy it. Just making 100 of them and selling them out in 2 seconds. Like and then going again. And that's one of my tips of something that's really caught my attention at the moment.
I think this is a great point because like in this little like on chain scene or whatever, and we're talking about the evolution or shifts of platforms like Zora and many others, whatever it is. Shout out to Catalog and Sound and like wherever music is happening and things like that. But it's a big world out there. There's so much you can be doing on the internet, new things to be exploring, and kind of just like the process of what you're creating and putting out and being inspired to try new shit. I mean, a lot of people in the crypto scene probably don't vibe with TikTok in any way. So they're not on TikTok, like, but they're hanging out on Farcaster or Lens instead. Like, but
Yeah.
maybe there's more out there for all of us. Like maybe don't just climb down into a tiny little pigeonholed scene. Choose your own echo chamber, but it's new, so it's cool. Probably it's like maybe there's other places that we can be hanging out or building new worlds that connect out into those other things. You said something way earlier in this conversation. I'm gonna sort of paraphrasing it, but sort of like putting stuff together that can like reach out. Like if all these like music scenes are happening way off the radar and it's not breaking out into like popular consciousness or whatever, but like where is it going to come from? And I kind of feel like some of these like new collectivist kind of on-chain projects and stuff represent something that could work. Like I'm interested in what Austin Roby is doing with Subvert, for example.
Yeah.
What they're saying is
See what
collectively
happens.
owned Bandcamp alternative and all that. Like someone that I really jive with in general, and like his writing is really interesting to check out and stuff like that. But it's kind of like, okay, that sounds interesting. Get a few thousand artists on a Bandcamp alternative, and if the music's great and you can kind of through the effect of shared discovery of everyone's combined audiences or whatever. Like maybe that can really be something that breaks out of the bubble. Also conscious that Subvert is not a crypto related project, but yeah, you know.
No. I mean, same with Meta Label, right? Like I'm working on a Meta Label drop where we've curated like a catalog of like all these different projects that people have experimented with, mainly on chain over the last 2 years, all these different creators, because in my mind, I was like, this is the thing that's happening. It's a movement. There's all these creators like basically distributing their music in a way that's unique to their identity. And the internet makes that, like traditional social media makes that very hard to do. The blockchain has opened up a lot of creativity, even if it's just like a psychological thing where someone can say, yeah, you could do that normally, but so much interesting stuff's happened. And I want to do that on Meta Label because again, a Meta Label it bridges a gap. It kind of has a lot of like blockchain ethos in it, whereby yes, it actually does do splits. I can't do a drop on Bandcamp where I put in the people's names and they all get a percentage of every pound that comes through. Right? I can't do that. Why can't we do that? That's insane. But there's no financial incentive for Bandcamp to change that because they don't need to because they've established it as not happening, right? But with something like MetaLabel, I can collate these, I think it's like 30 artists into like a release, a digital release, and some normal person can buy that with a card, download it, and it just goes directly to those artists. There's no contract, there's no like, you know, the tooling is becoming really interesting. And the blockchain still does that cheaper and more efficiently than all these different combinations of PayPal, accounting, spreadsheets, all these different cuts. And I think we are moving forward now to like, what can we do with this thing that is useful and interesting, to other people, rather than just saying, here's something beautiful, you should pay for it, which I also agree with. Um, there is something else happening now, which is that, yeah, I guess that layer twos are affording us, and layer threes, which is, you know, we're moving into this utility age of tooling, of, what can we now do? What can we build on this stuff that really does something that you can't do elsewhere, even if that something is just cheaper. That is pretty exceptional. I have a lot of stuff I have to do with accounting, and I'm starting to see glimpses of like, yeah, a joint wallet, doing something. And I also would say that I am enjoying the fact that we're going back to having differentiation. Like Zora's doing a thing, but I can still go to Super Collector and spend $10 on a song because I want to support that artist. Like an owner version of that song that feels more valuable than one that costs, 10 cents, right? Like, because really, like, I like Zora and I collect. The problem is like I will collect stuff now as a signal of support when it doesn't actually support the person, right? Like I will collect everything that Yuri does in public, or like that Dutchy posts in his like archival process, or that Latasha does, or any of my friends that use that platform. But I'm very aware when I'm doing it that it doesn't make the same impact. So now it really spurs me on to go and look at what other ways can I go and support them, right? Like what have they got on catalog? What have they got on, what other pieces have they got out there? What other things have they got going on? Um, and I do like differentiation. I do think like when I got into this, I did like that, catalog was one of ones and sound was, one of 25 and, other places could do other things. And I think that's okay too, right? Like brands, ethoses and approaches and different shops. Um, so I quite like we're kind of coming a little bit back to that again. But yeah, hopefully some of these places that I love still remain because as we've learned, it's a really challenging place to build a business.
Of course, I'm based here in Amsterdam, and ADE is just around the corner. And I know you were starting to tell me that you're coming to do some stuff, maybe workshop type things, music things.
Yeah, so I'm taking part in like an IP and royalty management workshop, I guess, by Original Works and Core Protocol, which is related to what Pixel Links are doing and Chorus. And there's a lot happening with what they're doing in terms of like, cataloging IP and linking that on chain with what's happening in streaming and like digital distribution, but also, some really like cool remix stuff that Chorus are doing in terms of like what you can do with stems as a musician, and kind of, that I'm very much into this kind of like co-collaboration, participation stuff. So I'm going to be taking part in that workshop, which is on the 16th, which I think actually there is some possibility for others to join if you want to hit me up. Um, and yeah, and then I'm just going to be hanging out at ADE. I don't know exactly, I haven't got plans yet, but there's always gigs, there's always meetings, and they always come up every year. And my usual answer is I'm not going. But this year I can be like, yeah, let's hook up and hang out. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm going to try to attend ADE at a higher level. I think this time last year I was in the UK coincidentally in one of the main weeks of it and stuff. But yeah, I'm super looking forward to some music things and maybe getting along to some workshops, including the one that you're doing. Sounds interesting. Before we jump off, I guess like open invitation for you to share, like where should people go online to like check out some of your recent work, and as they would say on Hot Ones, tell the people what you've got going on.
Okay, yeah, I mean normal socials, right? You can find me everywhere. I am leaning more these days heavily in Instagram because it's just like feels like a healthier ecosystem to be a part of, given, you know, Elon and everything. But yeah, I am active on Lens, I'm active on Walkcast, and I am still working on the Scenes project, like if you haven't checked it out yet, go to my profiles, check out Scenes. It's a project that I ran over the last year with collaborating with the audience members to co-create works of art around a music release. We created our own ecosystem. And at the moment, I'm working on an exhibition. So I'm looking for venues and places to exhibit it as an art piece, and doing some video commissions for it to turn it into like an immersive exhibition. And there's also going to be a postcard book. So it's going to be called Prompts to Reflect, and it's basically a collection of all the memories that everybody has submitted. So over 350 people submitted like a personal memory to the project. So we're going to take those memories, and we're going to share them. And the idea is that people take a pause from their life, a pause from social media, and take a minute to reflect on the value of music, and on how that's connected with moments of their life. So yeah, that's the next stage. And I'm looking to take some meetings with some people to help out on the exhibition, and hoping to sort of, I guess, continue this exploration of what is, a new world for music careers that involves like IRL exhibitions, products. We're making a book, and what is a world we can build around a piece of music with our audience. And I'm kind of continuing that journey now with an exhibition and yeah, merch. So we will see. But yeah, if you want to join the ride, we're sharing it all online, and you can follow the journey.
Thank you to Jamie, Sound of Fractures, for coming on UFO. Links for his music, releases, and projects are in the show notes. Thanks to our sponsors who made this episode possible. To join high agency crypto natives in a new experiment in on-chain brands, visit aimhigher.net. To access native liquidity and financial infrastructure for the meme sector, check out internationalmeme.fund. This is Nick Hollands, signing off from UFO.